Welcome to the Solid Signal podcast for the week of March 28th, 2022. This is part 2 of the first ever 2-part podcast for Solid Signal, and it's about the Oscars. Now, when I started the first part of this last week, I had no idea what I was in for. Matter of fact, I think nobody had any idea what they were in for with this particular Oscars broadcast. I only wanted to do it because I thought, okay, the Oscars are really trying to change things up and trying to improve ratings, and I wanted to talk about why that was good or bad or indifferent. And I hope that if you haven't heard that podcast yet, that you'll go to blog.solidsignal.com, click on the word podcasts up toward the top, and find last week's podcast, because this is really, like I said, kind of part 2, and if you're not really versed in what I said in part 1, some of it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. But let's talk. I guess we may as well start with the elephant in the room. Of course, there was one and precisely one thing that everybody is talking about today about the Oscars broadcast. And yes, it involved Will Smith and Chris Rock. And no, there's not a lot that I'm going to say about it. I will say that just like all good arguments, the biggest problem is what you're arguing about. And there are a lot of sides to this. There's a lot that's going on. And I think a lot of it on both sides is valid. A lot of it on both sides is invalid. And I'm not going to say I don't care, because I do care. But at the same time, it's not the point. The point is, did this telecast work? Why or why not? And one of the reasons that the telecast did not work, in my opinion, obviously, was there was a pretty big shock in the middle of it. Nobody quite recovered. And it colored the rest of the broadcast in a way that was utterly unavoidable. And I think that I'll probably get into that in a little while. But let's start from the beginning. First of all, nothing but respect for the 3 hosts, Amy Schumer and Regina Hall and Wanda Sykes, who worked as hard as any hosts have ever worked. I think that we actually saw more of them than we saw of most hosts, and most of their humor was topical and reasonable, and some of it was silly, and I don't necessarily agree that there was too much of it, but I think that as you get to the point where the show is getting long, yeah, it becomes harder and harder to justify some of these bits that they were doing. And really, that's kind of the biggest problem with the broadcast. The broadcast was 3.5 hours long, a little bit more than that, I think. And it was supposed to have been cut down so that it could be definitely below 3 hours. It turned out to be one of the longer broadcasts, despite the fact that some of the things that we really wanted to see, like presentation of the Governor's Award, did not appear. What did appear surprisingly in relative completion were a lot of the acceptance speeches from a lot of the categories that were given out before the official broadcast started. Now, I'm told that a lot of these speeches were edited down for time, and of course they kind of didn't go through the banter at the beginning, and they didn't highlight the nominees, and I get that, but they did end up showing at least some of the acceptance speeches, and you saw people's faces, which really probably goes a long way toward accommodating the argument that these folks, deserve to be on global television instead of on streaming or something like that. But it didn't work. It didn't work because they did not make the broadcast any tighter. It did not make it go any faster. Now, what did work, in my opinion, was a lot of the ways that they tried to modernize the broadcast. Now, I'm the first one to say it wasn't my cup of tea, and I know that some of my other readers and listeners feel the same way. It did not have an old Hollywood feeling to it, and it was, there was a DJ, there was a rock band, there was some very topical humor and a little bit of snark, quite a bit of snark, in fact, in most of it was not the subject of any violence whatsoever. But it was a much harder-edged broadcast in a lot of ways, and a lot more appealing to the younger people, I think, but a lot less appealing to the older people, who tend to be the ones who watch television. But I think that really, when you look at it, I think that the Oscars were trying to appeal to a younger crowd. I think that was appealing to a younger crowd, and I applaud them for not just kind of going gently into that good night, as it were. and not just riding off into the sunset on the tales of baby boomers who've been watching the broadcast their whole life. They're trying to stay relevant, but it didn't work. It didn't work for a lot of reasons. One of the things, now they added these sort of fan favorite categories, which came and went really quickly, and it didn't work because I understand that there were a number of Zack Snyder fans who kind of bombed the voting and just took it all over. And the results were that it didn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people why particular things were chosen. And it ended up feeling like the Academy said they were going to do this thing, and so they had to do it as quickly as possible, but they didn't really want to linger on it because they realized rather quickly it was not a good idea. And it wasn't. So they got past it as quick as they could. I ended up getting the same feeling from some of the other packages. Now, I'm a big fan of the movie The Godfather, one of the greatest films of all time, a masterclass in filmmaking, as a matter of fact. And the tribute they did to The Godfather made absolutely no sense. It was rushed. It was just a series of clips. And the same thing could be said about the James Bond tribute. There was no context. There was no reason for it to be there. And it did not even give you a terribly good idea, what the entire spirit of the Bond franchise was. None of it made any sense. I took the most offense, and I actually was flat out offended by the way the In Memoriam segment went. Now, there's been a trend in the last 5 to 10 years of celebrating people's lives with happiness and joy instead of solemnity and sadness. And I think that was the intention here. But literally the names and faces of these people who deserve to be honored were literally overshadowed by singing and dancing. I mean, in other words, there were people in front of the screen whose shadows were being cast onto these names. I mean, I'm not trying to be figurative in any way. That didn't work for me because I understand the joy of celebrating these people, but you weren't focusing on these people. I want to talk about that subject we don't talk about, and that's Bruno. Now, with all apologies to my old friend Judy, who I hope is listening to this podcast, I don't think this worked. She did think it worked, but it didn't work for me for two reasons. I think that it was a really kind of a big waste of talent because it wasn't very well produced. You couldn't hear people singing. It was very hard to understand what they were saying because it wasn't well mic'd. And yeah, it was cool to have everybody kind of out in the audience, but you couldn't follow where everybody was going or what anybody was saying. I would have much, much more enjoyed a literal singing of the song instead of having new lyrics, which came off as almost kind of mocking the Oscar broadcast and seeming awfully silly in the way that a middle school pageant would. I would have loved to have seen a reenactment of what was going on, especially a lot of the kind of intertwining melodies that actually take place at the end of that song. Instead, we got this kind of, rah-rah kind of let's love the Oscars set to the tune of We Don't Talk About Bruno. And, there were some incredibly talented people who were singing that. And unfortunately, you didn't get to hear them or see them. It didn't work for me. Speaking of incredibly talented, I have to put out my personal disappointment in saying that I wish that Lin-Manuel Miranda had won for his original song, which I think is a better song than the Billie Eilish song. And that's subjective. That's my particular feeling. But I think that it's a more heartfelt song. It's a sweeter song. And maybe the Academy voters didn't vote for it because they didn't take the time to Google translate it. And it's in Spanish, and maybe that just didn't connect with them. I'll admit it didn't connect with me the first time I heard it until I did Google Translate on it. It's an incredibly sweet song. Overall, what to do with the Academy Awards broadcast next year, I don't know. I think I would get rid of a lot of the packages. I would get rid of a lot of the fan favorite stuff and the tribute stuff. All of that seems like it belongs in the pre-shows where you find a lot of that stuff. And even so, when I'm watching the the pre-shows and the red carpet runway stuff. I'd zap past it even then, and I don't care for it. And I'd say there's a way to make it a fun event, way to make it a relevant event, but still also make it feel like there's a sense of dignity and honor to the work that's being done. More than any of these award shows, I think the Oscars has always represented a very forward and progressive agenda. Some people like that, some people don't. But more often than not, if you look at older broadcasts, they tend to have been on the right side of history. That's all I'm going to say there. And so that's not the problem. Unlike other award shows like the Golden Globes and whatnot, the politics of it, whether or not it belongs in the show, hasn't really been the problem. The problem is that it seemed kind of stuffy and old school, and that's made it undesirable to younger folks who find it inaccessible. I do think there should be more changes made to make it a more accessible show. That said, it's okay for the Oscars to be a more dignified kind of event. I mean, it's not the MTV Movie Awards. Let's just be honest. It's not like the Nickelodeon Kids Awards. It's not even the Golden Globes. It's the Oscars. It's the grand old whatever of award shows. Now, I would like to see, for example, some of the presentations be live again, like the Lifetime Achievement Awards, Governor's Awards, that sort of thing. I don't think that we need to return to the days of, showing the accountants and whatever. I think that you could have more than one broadcast like they do for the Emmys, where you broke it out and you had, some of the more technological categories different from some of the more celebrity-facing categories. I think that's good. And planning is probably better. I do like the idea of an opening number. I think that the We Don't Talk About Bruno number, it felt like kind of an homage to the old opening numbers with Billy Crystal and Whoopi Goldberg, but it didn't work. Nothing wrong with having the opening number or having that kind of thing. Just, don't let it get in the way. I'll say one more thing, and then this podcast, which is already pretty long, is going to come to a close. There was one really kind of tone-deaf moment, and I don't know if anybody else kind of held their breath a little bit. And this is one of those things. It was such a shocking night that I think by the time this came, nobody knew what to say or do. There was this little bit at the end where, Amy Schumer was talking about seat fillers, and, she got to Kirsten Dunst and she said, please, stand up because, we don't need a seat filler right now. In other words, accusing Kirsten Dunst of being a seat filler. If none of the other stuff had happened during the night, well, that might have been a slightly unfunny joke that would have just come and gone. They should have cut it in deference to what had happened when they really were unkind to Jada Pinkett Smith earlier. And especially, it seemed like now a lot of people don't realize that Jesse Plemons is Kirsten Dunst's husband in real life, not just in The Power of the Dog. He said, "You realize that's my wife." And I felt like there was going to be some sort of setup to mock what had happened earlier, and then everybody seemed really sheepish about it. The whole thing should have been cut, especially since the broadcast was running too long. And by that time, it just felt like a train that was barreling out of control, and nobody knew what to do. This is going to be an Oscar ceremony like back in whatever it was in 2014, whatever the year it was that they confused La La Land and Moonlight. It's going to be one that we keep talking about over and over and over again, and not for a good reason. So, okay, kudos to you, Oscars, for trying to do something different. You didn't succeed. Keep it up. Keep trying to do the right thing, and you'll get it better next year. That's it for the Solid Signal podcast. And given the way that this two-part podcast went, I'm not sure that I'll be doing another one of them unless it gets great listenership. That's up to you. Like and subscribe always makes me look good to my bosses. And I will be back next week, probably a little bit more on topic.